absolutely delighted to be able to be here. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you about this very important theme that's very close to my heart. I wish I would have been able to understand the previous presentation. I was following it, but sadly my language skills don't stretch that far, so I wasn't able to, but I'm sure it was very interesting and enjoyable. It looked like it. So yes, my talk today is really about changing work and what that means when we're thinking about lifelong learning. And it's based on our research project where we've been looking at how technology changes work, people management and processes, learning and organizational culture. And our data is amongst the 50 biggest companies in Finland, some of them multinationals as well. And we've been interviewing them over the 4 years, once a year. And so mainly this, all I'm saying is based on that data, the types of changes and frictions we see happening. And why is this important? Because when we're thinking about learning, as I'm sure you know, I know you're all seasoned professionals, it's not just about deciding that now we should all learn for the rest of our days and then A leading to B, but it's a far more complex process. And there needs to be motivation, there needs to be incentives, there needs to be right kind of culture, right kind of leadership, right kind of organizational structures, etc., etc. And we also need to really rethink what we mean by learning. So therefore, contextualizing the situation where we are now in terms of work organizations, people management, is the be-all and end-all for beginning to understand this process better. I am absolutely positive that most of you are very aware of these things, so take it as a recap and bear with me. So as you know, when we talk about changing nature of work, this is something that the first thing to point out from the research and practice perspective is that this is nothing new. Work has always been changing. The industrial revolutions have followed each other. Each one of them has brought similar kind of challenges that we're facing now. What the researchers are very not in agreement about is what does the current fourth industrial revolution look like? What are the most important aspects of it? But everybody agrees that we now have the fourth industrial revolution. What does that mean? That means that we have available technologies that make change the way we work, change the way we organize processes, ideally would change the way we lead and manage. And if I'm thinking about our data, that is actually one of the parts that should change much faster than it has. And ironically, many of the management approaches that we're witnessing in our research data are still stemming back to the second industrial revolution, i.e. Taylorism, efficiency, productivity, looking at management as it was some kind of top-down project where you either trick your employees forward with the carrot or force them with the stick. Now, if we're looking at the present organizational environment going forward, that what technologies make possible and the different change processes, and more importantly, the sort of imperative of all of us in engaging into lifelong learning, we start realizing that this type of management leadership approach is not the one that fosters learning cultures. So therefore, even though work is changing, and this change is challenging us all, and the world is changing exponentially, as you know, the drivers being the emerging technology. People talk about digitalization, globalizing economy, sustainability issues, growing inequalities that have now been accelerated by the pandemic everywhere. These are all challenges that are present in all organizations. These are all direct challenges to our lifelong learning projects as well, because as we all know, needs go in an order of hierarchy. And if we're in a situation where we live in a constant state of flux and uncertainty, the environment is not very ripe for any kind of learning or approaching learning as something that you would like to do. So what we really need to understand when we're thinking about organizational learning, individual learning, lifelong learning, we need to understand that we really need to look at the context more carefully. We need to understand the main macro level change processes. And we need to understand that even though the technologies have changed greatly, and they changed the working processes as well, the basics of human psychology have not changed. Someone asked me not long ago I was giving a speech about this somewhere else, and they were asking me that, okay, so when do our brain then change? And I responded by saying that, well, I'm not a brain researcher, so I'm not going to say anything about this. But as far as I know, they're not going to be able to say anything for quite some time. They also need longitudinal data. But what when I'm looking at our data, for instance, in terms of the changes in these almost 40 organizations operating in different environments and in different kinds of fields, the problem is never the technologies. You can always find the best experts to explain that what technologies you should have. The problem is neither the processes of work. Experienced people can redesign the processes of work. The problem, i.e. the friction, and maybe the reason why we're not all learning exponentially or taking these innovation leaps or efficiency leaps or effectivity leaps, is always what the technology researchers call the human interface. That is that the change and the quality of it, people's ability, willingness, eagerness to learn and to be engaged, depends on how well you manage the human interface, how well you understand the macro level change and then the consequent micro level change in your own organization, and what the implications of that are for your leaders and for your people. And how are your leaders able to lead and manage through this growingly complex context? If I had to give this speech with one slide alone, I would do it with this one. It's one of my favorite interview quotes. It's a top manager of a multinational technology company responding to my question about what's biggest changes, biggest thinking around technology, work, people management. What are you spending most of your time thinking about? And they respond, if you want engagement, you have to think about inclusion. And that they have been thinking about inclusion and what that means in their organization. And now by inclusion, we're talking about diversity of different kinds, and then the added demand to learn all the time. Technological skills, ability. We have interview quotes where top management say that our employees just learn to use Outlook and Excel fluently. Now we have something new coming. They have a feeling of being overwhelmed. They have a feeling that their skills are not up to date. How do we make sure that everybody gets the sort of training or whatever they need, support, facilitation, to be on the level where their willingness to learn more is not depending on their lack of skill or ability not to feel included in all the change? Because that's another thing to understand about this current situation in organizations or in the world, as you all know. We live in a constant change, and we will for some years to come. So if we recap a little bit about what are the central change processes we need to think about when we start thinking about organizational learning, before we need to understand that we live in a growingly volatile, unequal, and complex context. There is a reason why the top managers of top corporations are now queuing up for the inequality lectures in sociology, because they understand that the context, the growing inequalities, is going to have an implication for all of us in all organizations. There is the changing content of particularly knowledge work. It's going to become, and is already, more complex, more creative, more social, and more digital. We recently had some roundtables with some top managers from private, public, and third sector, and we were talking about the types of skills they expect from our university graduates. They spend most of the time talking about skills that we all would call soft: human skills, empathy, people skills, thinking about reflecting what kind of energy do you bring to the room, and very little time in talking about the sort of, if you like, hard skills, saying that we can teach them. Mainly there was focus that you need to be sort of open and able to sort of learn and adapt to new technologies and take in big data. There's a growing disconnection of work from time and place. Corona crisis has really forced us all to distant work and take distance in any ways, making it visible how many myths we have around where work can be done and how. There is a disconnection from work from traditional employment. That when we're thinking forward, we're thinking of new hybrid ways of working, we're thinking of life-wide learning, what it means, for instance, in a situation when someone is not in an employment contract to you. How are you going to incentivize that? Who should incentivize that if people are all entrepreneur and just working gigs for different organizations? There is the growing platform and gig economy and the sort of, if you like, friction with the social structures, because the social structures of work, the societal level structures of work have not caught up in, this is like a global problem. The laws are still lagging behind, and there's a lot of question about how much do we need to protect, how much do we need to give flexibility. And there's the polarizing job market. There are those, the experts whose job, more or less, if you're a coder in Helsinki, you can define the terms of your employment, and on the other hand, the disappearing jobs. And now all of these change processes accelerated by COVID-19, particularly the inequalities. Because there's one thing we know about the pandemic, it treats people very unequally. So to kind of sum up the macro levels change and the effect it has on organizational structure, we've gone from fairly hierarchical structures, position-based power, towards more and more flat structures, expertise power, where in the other end there are the sort of talent, and the other end the disappearing jobs and the growing inequalities. And the big question is, how do we balance this out in our organizations? The experts are probably more likely, and you don't need to be incentivized so much to learn, but what about people who lose their jobs? Where do you commit to lifelong learning if you don't have your job and not really that much education to begin with? I was participating in this conference about lifelong learning not long ago, where someone was saying that when we talk about lifelong learning, this was a professor who studied this for a long time, saying that we always have a group of doctors and masters who of XYZ who want to kind of have an intrinsic need to learn and think that it's something that's fun and you want to engage in. And then what we really should be thinking about is, what does this lifelong learning mean in different places of our society, and how do we incentivize that everywhere, not just for experts? So another little recap, what's changing and what's not. Work's not going to go away. It will always persist. It has all across the industrial revolutions. This has always been discussed, and work has always persisted. But it will change form. All the jobs will change, and some of the jobs, as you well know, will also go away. Management leadership would need to follow the suit and change and facilitate for this. And this kind of thinking about lifelong learning should be inbuilt in all of the management leadership approaches to the change, because it's something that we all need to consider. And we should all take some kind of agency in it. We should all be considering, okay, what part of my job can the machine already now do better than me? What should I then focus on? What are the areas where I should become better? Technology researchers also point out that the way we should be looking at our organizational order or learning or thinking going forward is we should be problematizing the technologies much more. They always say when we have discussions with them that you're oddly sort of critiqueless when it comes to technologies. Why don't you ask more? Who coded this? Who developed it? Where did it come from? What are the purposes? If we're thinking about, for instance, the artificial intelligence solutions that we have at the moment, they're all human coded. So why aren't we asking more questions? And why are we proactively more considering what should we use, where and why, and where do we still need human touch more? The list in the bottom of the slide, what people are still better than robots in, is something that that's the base for all of those future work skills. That's the basis for the reason why those top managers participating in our roundtable were focusing on the soft skills, because we know that going forward, these are the skills that we're going to need. Sometimes people get a bit panicky about this and they're really wondering, like, what does that mean? Can I learn empathy? If someone doesn't know, you can actually. If you put it in YouTube, there are videos that teach you how to act empathetically. But the thing is that when you're looking at technology research, instances like MIT researchers are pointing out that the way these technologies learn, artificial intelligence or robotics, they develop in jumps and in rather over a long time. It's impossible to predict when they will learn this and that. Thus, this for us as humans is a good news because it gives us time to adjust. We have a lot of time to adjust and adapt and start creating a more sustainable future work where this kind of learning approach, lifelong learning, is ingrained in all organizations with the understanding that that's the only sustainable way going forward on a societal, organizational, and individual levels. So if I have to sum up our research data that what's the problem if we're thinking about if there's an organizational problem when we're talking about how technologies change, organizations work, leadership. It's always the human mindset and the way that it's stuck somewhere else where it should be. And what we see, like going forward, we should all be taking, as I said, understanding that this is not changing nature of work, lifelong learning. These are not things that are on someone else's responsibility, but these are things that should be taken on 3 different levels. We should all be carrying the individual responsibility, organizations should take their responsibility, and societies at the same time. And there is a fairly strong global research and research organization consensus that only this way, by taking this responsibility on all of these 3 levels, we're going to be able to build a more sustainable future of work. And there, what we mean is that we need to, on an individual level, we would be needing to take a proactive approach to our own work. Hopefully, you're all having a proactive approach to your own health. So you think, oh, I haven't been in the dentist this year, better go for a checkup. Much in the same way, thinking about your lifelong learning, you're learning, oh, I haven't learned anything new skills at work. What could I think about? What could I do? And I think that, as you all know, and you're professionals in this, and I'm sure someone's already said this today, we should be really rethinking of what we mean by learning. It's not going to the course like it was 20 years ago. It's something completely different. So I think it's a question of thinking about your thinking around learning and changing your mindset and kind of taking the agency over your own learning, and in organization, taking the agency over your people, over your employees, over your leaders, and considering what is it that you all need going forward. And obviously then the societal level, providing incentives for all of us to keep doing this. This is very important because if you go into any more detail with any theories on learning, adult learning, I've used that as an example here, you start bumping into words like what I've used here. They're more self-directed. They need to know why they should learn something. Self-initiated learning is the most lasting and pervasive. The learning should be applicable to learners' work. These are all now keywords, and I'm sure you've heard them sometime today. This has been the topic of your seminar. But this is the thing, this is the reason why we really need to understand the way the organizational culture looks like. Do we have the type of leadership approach that fosters learning? Do we have a learning culture, or do we have a competing culture? Are people competing against each other, or are they perhaps harnessed with the growth mindset together, thinking about their growth together, learning together? But when we're looking at these theories, we see immediately that you need to give people incentives to learn, and then ideally they themselves start taking the agency and initiate their learning, because that's the way we learn in a permanent way. Another thing and another approach in terms of learning that's important is that we often think about learning just in the level of thinking. Yet we know that people learn, sometimes the real aha moments come from doing something. So in the organization, from the organizational perspective, it would be important to think about the lifelong learning in the organization also as a possibility to do things differently, to approach things differently. So when we're thinking about leading this kind of organizational culture, leading this kind of approach, we are talking about a move away from that second industrial revolution, focus on control, and focusing on collaboration, creating and fostering an environment where people are collaborating and learning together. So where does this leave us then? A lot of stuff, a lot of things to consider. And I would say that more than anything, a lot of analysis to do, because you cannot really start thinking about how people learn, how they should learn, what they should do, if you don't know what your organization looks like, if you don't know what your people can and cannot do. So it leaves us in a situation that we need to understand this, and ideally we start with organizational analysis and we share the responsibility. And I remind you that individual, we're talking about thinking about taking agency. What does lifelong learning mean for me? How do I do that? What about organization, the changing power relations, facilitating change and learning? How do we do that? What does that mean in terms of different employee groups? What does that mean in terms of different levels of leadership? And societal level, changing the societal structures, supporting organizations in all of this, how? If you're asking leading research engines and instances like MIT technology researchers, they're all pointing out that the smart policy making, understanding the demands of the future of work, what it means, what it doesn't mean, the growing flexibility that's not going to go back, and how could we as society support that in a sustainable way? And sustainability here is a key word, because we do know that if we continue with the same structures, with the same approaches to working and learning, that's not sustainable. We're all going to be more or less worn out in the end. You don't need to be on your own in this project. There are lots of research around. This is just ours. That's our website. We have a recently opened MOOC, online learning course, where you can go and learn about the details of future work on societal, organizational, and individual levels. You can even get a certificate if you want. But there are many other great instances where a lot of research on this is being published as reports. So that's a great support function when you start doing the analysis of this. And I would really, I guess, more than anything else, I would encourage, and this is something that I'm also myself actively working on with my colleagues, I would encourage us all to, I hate this saying that we need to think outside the box. I think we rather should be thinking about the box. And I think that what we really should be now doing is thinking about the box where we placed work in for the last, I don't know how many years. I'm not going to say, because there's so many research disagreement over the years, but I'm going to say that we need to unpack the box of work, and then we need to rethink it. And we need to understand that this time and space concepts that we're operating with are something that we created, so we can also rethink them. So I encourage you to go and unpack the box of work and think about what you start seeing mean in terms of fostering or hindering organizational learning, lifelong learning. And I thank you for this. And I think we now have some time. If you have any questions or comments, that would be great.